Hello and welcome to today's story. My name is Philip, and I like to dive deep into scary Asian stories and cover them in my videos. If you have an interesting story you want me to cover, let me know in the comments. I always read all comments. For now, let's get into today's story, where we have a few terrifying stories to share. One of them is this story. There are places in Manila where even the bravest security guards refuse to work alone at night. Buildings so thick with dread that the air itself feels heavier the moment you step inside. One such place is the abandoned Santa Carmela Academy for Girls, a shuttered Catholic school on the edge of Quezon City, where the walls still smell faintly of incense and old wood polish. The windows are boarded over now, the iron gates chained shut, but those who live nearby still speak in hushed tones about what happened there in the autumn of 2009. It wasn't a sudden tragedy that closed the school, not a fire or scandal, but something far stranger, something that began with a single sighting during evening prayer and ended with parents pulling their daughters out in the middle of the semester, refusing to let them return no matter what the nuns promised. The story they tell is of a figure that shouldn't have been there, a woman in a torn habit hanging motionless from the rafters above the chapel, visible only for a few seconds before vanishing into the shadows as if she had never been real at all. Santa Carmela had been a Catholic girls' school for nearly 70 years, founded by French missionaries in the late 1930s and passed down through generations of strict, disciplined nuns who believed in rigid schedules, mandatory chapel attendance, and the kind of silence that made even whispered prayers feel like transgressions. The building itself was old and sprawling, with narrow hallways lined with faded portraits of former Mother Superiors, wooden floors that creaked underfoot, and a chapel at the center of the campus, with tall vaulted ceilings and rows of wooden pews worn smooth by decades of kneeling students. By 2009, enrollment had been declining for years, the school struggling to compete with modern institutions, but it still held on to its traditions with an iron grip. Evening prayer was mandatory every night at 6:30. A 20-minute service where the girls would kneel in silence while the nuns led them through the rosary. It was during one of these services, on a Thursday in late October, that the first sighting occurred. Sister Beatriz, the school's vice principal, was leading the prayer from the front of the chapel when one of the younger students, a girl named Maricel, let out a sharp gasp and pointed upward toward the rafters near the back of the room. Several other girls turned to look, and what they saw made the blood drain from their faces. Hanging from one of the wooden beams, swaying slightly as if caught in a breeze that didn't exist, was the figure of a nun. Her habit was torn and stained, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, and her face, pale and bruised, stared down at them with wide, unblinking eyes. The vision lasted only a few seconds before it faded, disappearing into the shadows as if it had been nothing more than a trick of the light, but the damage was done. The girls began screaming, stumbling over each other as they tried to flee the chapel, and Sister Beatriz, her voice shaking, tried desperately to restore order. When she looked up at the rafters herself, there was nothing there, no body, no rope. Only the faint creak of old wood settling in the silence. The school administrators tried to dismiss the incident as mass hysteria, a shared delusion brought on by stress or exhaustion, but the girls who had seen the figure refused to let it go. They described it in vivid detail, the way the nun's habit hung in tatters, the bruises around her neck, the way her eyes seemed to follow them even as she swayed in place. Sister Beatriz ordered the chapel closed for inspection, and when the maintenance staff climbed up to examine the rafters, they found something that made their hands tremble. Etched deep into the wood of the beam where the figure had been seen were grooves, burns really, the kind of marks left by heavy rope, pulled tight under immense weight. The wood was scorched black in places, as if something had been there for a long time, and when they measured the depth of the grooves, they realized the marks were far too old to have been made recently. The chapel had been inspected and cleaned just a month earlier, and there had been no mention of any damage to the rafters. Yet here they were, unmistakable and impossible to explain. The nuns held an emergency meeting that night, debating whether to inform the parents or keep the incident quiet, but the decision was taken out of their hands when several students went home and told their families what they had seen. By the following Monday, nearly a third of the girls had been withdrawn from the school, their parents furious and terrified, demanding answers that the nuns couldn't provide. The chapel remained closed, but the sightings didn't stop. Security guards patrolling the grounds at night began reporting strange sounds coming from the area above the chapel, footsteps running back and forth across the attic floor. Despite the fact that the attic had been sealed shut for years, the entrance boarded over and covered with dust that hadn't been disturbed in decades. One of the guards, a man named Ernesto who had worked at the school for nearly 10 years, was the first to investigate the sounds. It was just past midnight on a Wednesday when he heard the footsteps again, loud and frantic, as if someone was running for their life. He stood in the hallway below the attic, listening to the rhythmic pounding of feet on wood, and felt his stomach twist with unease. He knew the attic was sealed, knew there was no way anyone could have gotten up there, but the sound was too real, too insistent to ignore. He radioed his partner, a younger man named Joel, and together they went to find a ladder and pry open the attic entrance. The boards came away with a groan of protest, releasing a cloud of dust that made them cough and cover their faces. Ernesto shone his flashlight up into the darkness, the beam cutting through the gloom to reveal a narrow space filled with old furniture, stacks of forgotten textbooks, and cobwebs that hung thick as curtains. There was no one there, no sign that anyone had been up there in years, but as they stood at the base of the ladder, the footsteps started again, this time directly above them, so close they could feel the vibrations through the ceiling. Joel swore under his breath and backed away, his face pale, but Ernesto forced himself to climb the ladder, hauling himself up into the attic with his heart pounding in his chest. The space was cramped and suffocating, the air thick with the smell of mold and decay, and as he swept his flashlight across the room, he saw nothing but shadows and dust. The footsteps had stopped the moment he entered, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt unnatural. He was about to call down to Joel when he noticed something in the corner, half hidden behind a stack of old desks. It was a length of rope, frayed and blackened with age, coiled loosely on the floor. He moved closer, his breath catching in his throat, and saw that one end of the rope was tied in a noose, the knot still intact, the fibers stiff and brittle, as if they had been there for decades. Ernesto didn't touch the rope, didn't want to go anywhere near it, but as he stood there staring at it, he heard something that made his blood run cold. It was a sound like breathing, ragged and wet, coming from somewhere behind him. He spun around, his flashlight cutting wild arcs through the darkness, but there was no one there, just the empty attic and the shadows that seemed to press in closer with every passing second. The breathing continued, growing louder, more desperate, and then he heard it, a single word whispered so softly he almost didn't catch it. "Help!" The voice was female, hoarse and pleading, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the walls and ceiling. Ernesto didn't wait to hear more. He scrambled back toward the ladder, nearly falling in his haste to get out. And when he reached the hallway below, he slammed the boards back into place and refused to go near the attic again. Joel asked him what he had seen, but Ernesto couldn't find the words to explain, couldn't shake the feeling that something up there had been waiting for him, watching him with eyes he couldn't see. The next morning, he submitted his resignation, and within a week, 2 more guards followed suit, leaving the school scrambling to find replacements willing to work the night shift. The students who remained at Santa Carmela began to notice other things, small details that added up to a growing sense of unease. The chapel doors, which had been locked and secured every night, were often found standing open in the morning, the interior cold and smelling faintly of smoke. Several girls reported seeing a figure in a nun's habit standing at the end of the hallway late at night, always just out of reach, always turning away before they could get a clear look at her face. The breaking point came in early November, when a group of senior students decided to investigate the chapel after hours, determined to prove that the stories were nothing more than superstition. They waited until the nuns had retired for the night, then slipped out of their dormitory and made their way across the campus, armed with flashlights and a reckless confidence that came from not yet understanding what fear truly felt like. The chapel was dark and silent when they entered, the air heavy with the smell of old incense and wood polish. They moved slowly down the aisle, their footsteps echoing off the stone floor, and one of them, a girl named Isabel, dared the others to look up at the rafters where the figure had been seen. They all tilted their heads back, shining their flashlights upward, and for a moment there was nothing, just the shadowy outlines of the wooden beams crisscrossing the ceiling. Then, without warning, the temperature in the room plummeted, their breath misting in the air, and the lights began to flicker and dim. One of the girls screamed, and Isabel's flashlight beam landed on something that made her heart stop. Hanging from the center beam, swaying gently back and forth, was the figure of a nun. Her face was bruised and swollen, her eyes wide and glassy, and her mouth hung open as if frozen in the middle of a scream. The rope around her neck was taut, digging deep into the skin, and as they watched in horror, the figure's eyes moved, shifting downward to stare directly at them. Isabel felt her legs go weak, felt the scream building in her throat, and then the figure spoke, her voice a rasping whisper that filled the entire chapel. "Why did you leave me here?" The words were accusatory, filled with a grief so deep it felt like a physical weight pressing down on them, and then the figure began to descend, lowering slowly as if the rope were lengthening, bringing her closer and closer to where they stood, frozen in terror. The girls broke and ran, stumbling over each other in their panic, their screams echoing through the night as they fled the chapel and didn't stop until they reached the safety of their dormitory. The next day, Isabel told the nuns everything, her voice shaking, her hands trembling so badly she could barely hold a glass of water. The nuns listened in silence, their faces pale and drawn, and then Mother Superior made the decision to close the school indefinitely, effective immediately. Parents were called, arrangements were made, and within 2 weeks, Santa Carmela Academy for Girls was empty, the students and staff scattered, the building locked and abandoned. The story might have ended there, fading into local legend, but those who lived near the school continued to report strange occurrences. Lights were seen flickering in the chapel windows late at night, and more than one person claimed to hear the sound of a woman sobbing, the cries so loud and desperate they could be heard from the street. Urban explorers who broke into the building over the years reported feeling an overwhelming sense of dread the moment they stepped inside, and several claimed to have seen the figure of a nun standing in the shadows, her face obscured, her presence so oppressive it drove them out within minutes. The most disturbing detail, however, came from the archives of the Archdiocese, uncovered years later by a journalist investigating the school's closure. In 1947, a young nun named Sister Magdalena had been found hanged in the chapel attic, her death ruled a suicide, despite rumors that she had been punished for speaking out against the Mother Superior's cruelty. Her body had been removed, her name stricken from the records, and the incident buried so deeply that even the nuns who worked at the school in later years had no knowledge of it. But the rope marks on the rafters, the grooves burned into the wood, suggested that something of her had remained, trapped in the place where she had died, waiting for someone to acknowledge what had been done to her. The warnings passed down among those who knew the story were simple but firm. Never speak Sister Magdalena's name aloud after midnight. Never enter the chapel alone, and if you see a figure in a torn habit hanging from the rafters, do not look into her eyes. Those who ignored these rules reported hearing a sound like gasping breath directly behind them, a desperate, choking sound that followed them long after they left the building. Some woke in the night to find bruises around their own necks, faint but unmistakable, as if invisible hands had been testing their grip. Others claimed to see her reflection in mirrors and windows, always standing just behind them, her face bruised and her eyes filled with an accusation that felt personal, intimate, as if she knew something about them they had tried to forget. The building still stands today, though it has been condemned and marked for demolition more than once, the plans always falling through for reasons no one can quite explain. The locals avoid it, crossing to the other side of the street when they pass by, and those who have ventured inside in recent years say the chapel is the worst, a place where the air feels thick and suffocating, where the shadows seem to move on their own, and where, if you're unlucky enough, you might catch a glimpse of her, swaying gently from the rafters, her eyes wide open, waiting. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. But as chilling as that story was, it's far from the only one. In another part of Asia, something equally disturbing took place. A haunting that doesn't just frighten those who encounter it, but leaves them marked, scarred in ways that can't be explained by medicine or logic. In the narrow alleys of Osaka, where the old tenement buildings still lean against each other like tired survivors of a forgotten war, there walks a woman whose very presence brings the smell of smoke and the sound of sizzling flesh. Her story is one of fire and suffering, and those who cross her path are never quite the same again. The district of Nishinari in Osaka has always been rough around the edges, a place where the buildings are old and cramped, where the streets are narrow and poorly lit, and where poverty and desperation have left their marks on both the structures and the people who live there. In the winter of 1975, a fire broke out in one of the largest tenement buildings in the area, an aging structure that housed nearly 60 families in conditions that would have been considered unsafe, even by the standards of the time. The fire started just after midnight, spreading quickly through the wooden floors and thin walls, and by the time the fire trucks arrived, the building was already an inferno, the flames leaping high into the night sky and casting an orange glow over the entire neighborhood. Most of the residents managed to escape, fleeing into the streets in their night clothes, but nearly 20 people were trapped inside, overcome by smoke, or unable to find their way out through the maze of burning hallways. The screams that echoed through the night were said to be unbearable, the kind of sounds that stayed with you long after the flames had been extinguished. Among those trapped was a woman named Keiko Yamada, a 32-year-old seamstress who lived on the third floor with her elderly mother. Witnesses reported seeing her at one of the windows, her face pressed against the glass, pounding desperately as the smoke poured out around her. She was calling for help, her voice hoarse and panicked. But the flames were too intense, the heat too great for anyone to reach her. And then, in a moment that those who saw it would never forget, the window shattered, and Keiko fell forward, her body engulfed in flames as she tumbled onto the street below. The fire was eventually brought under control, but the damage was catastrophic. The building was gutted, reduced to a blackened skeleton of charred wood and twisted metal, and the bodies of the victims were recovered over the following days, many burned beyond recognition. Keiko's body was among them, though what was left of her was so badly charred that identification was only possible through dental records. The neighborhood mourned, as it always does after such tragedies, and life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. But within a few months, people began to report strange encounters in the alleys near the site of the fire. It started with the smell, a sudden overpowering stench of burning flesh and hair that would appear without warning, so strong it made people gag and cover their faces. The smell would linger for a few seconds, then vanish just as quickly, leaving behind only the faint acrid taste of smoke in the air. Then came the sightings. Late-night pedestrians walking through the narrow alleys would catch glimpses of a woman standing in the shadows, her figure barely visible in the dim light. She was always alone, always motionless, and always facing away, as if she were waiting for something or someone. Those who saw her described feeling an immediate sense of wrongness, a primal instinct that told them to turn around and walk the other way. Most did, but a few, driven by curiosity or concern, would call out to her, asking if she needed help. The woman never responded, never turned around, and after a few moments, she would simply vanish, fading into the darkness, as if she had never been there at all. The first person to see her face was a taxi driver named Hiroshi Tanaka, who was driving through Nishinari late one night in the spring of 1976, when he saw a woman standing at the side of the road, her arm raised as if flagging him down. He pulled over, assuming she needed a ride, and waited as she approached the passenger window. When she leaned down to look inside, Hiroshi felt his heart nearly stop. Her face was charred black, the skin cracked and peeling, revealing raw red flesh beneath. Her eyes were the only part of her that seemed untouched, glowing white against the burned skin, but they were wet, dripping with tears that looked thick and viscous, almost like molten wax. She opened her mouth as if to speak, and Hiroshi saw that her teeth were blackened stumps, her tongue swollen and blistered. Before she could say anything, he jammed his foot on the accelerator and sped away, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip the steering wheel. When he looked in the rearview mirror, she was gone, the street empty and silent. He reported the encounter to the police, but they dismissed it as a prank or a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. Hiroshi knew what he had seen, though, and he refused to drive through Nishinari at night ever again. Other sightings followed, each one more disturbing than the last. A young couple walking home from a late dinner reported hearing footsteps behind them, a slow dragging sound, accompanied by a faint sizzling, like meat cooking on a hot griddle. When they turned around, they saw a woman walking a few meters behind them, her face hidden in shadow, her movements stiff and unnatural. They quickened their pace, and the footsteps behind them quickened as well, matching their speed exactly. The couple broke into a run, and the footsteps followed, growing louder and faster until they burst out onto a main road where there were people and lights. The woman was no longer behind them, but when they looked down at their necks, both of them found burn marks, handprints seared into their skin as if someone had pressed red-hot palms against them while they ran. The stories spread quickly, and the woman became known as the cinder-faced woman, a vengeful spirit who haunted the alleys near the site of the old tenement fire. Some believed she was Keiko Yamada, unable to rest after the horrific way she had died, while others thought she might be a manifestation of all the victims, their collective suffering given form. The local priests were called in to perform blessings and exorcisms, but nothing seemed to help. The sightings continued, and the number of people who reported encountering her grew steadily. The pattern was always the same. She would appear late at night, usually in the narrow alleys where the streetlights barely reached, and she would follow anyone who had the misfortune of crossing her path. She never spoke, never made any overt threats, but her presence was enough to inspire pure terror. Those who turned to look at her face often described the same details: the charred skin, the glowing white eyes, the tears that seemed to burn as they fell. And almost all of them reported waking the next morning to find burn marks somewhere on their bodies, usually on the neck or hands, as if she had reached out and touched them while they slept. The marks were not severe, just superficial burns that healed within a few days, but the psychological impact was far worse. People became paranoid, afraid to walk alone at night, afraid to sleep without checking every corner of their rooms first. In the autumn of 1978, a group of university students decided to investigate the legend, convinced that the sightings could be explained through psychology or environmental factors. They spent several nights in the alleys near the old tenement site, equipped with cameras, recording equipment, and notebooks filled with theories about mass hysteria and urban legends. For the first 2 nights, nothing happened. They walked the same routes where sightings had been reported, waited in the darkest corners, and found nothing but empty streets and silence. On the 3rd night, however, their luck changed. It was just past 2 in the morning when one of the students, a young man named Takeshi, noticed the smell. It came suddenly, a thick, choking odor of burned meat and hair, so strong it made him retch. He called out to the others, and they gathered around him, all of them smelling it now, their faces pale and uneasy. Then they heard the footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere behind them. They turned as a group, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, and saw her. She was standing at the far end of the alley, her figure silhouetted against the faint glow of a distant streetlight. Her face was in shadow, but they could see the way she tilted her head, as if studying them, deciding what to do. For a long moment, no one moved, no one spoke, and then she began to walk toward them, her steps accompanied by that awful sizzling sound, as if each footfall was burning the pavement beneath her. Takeshi raised his camera and took a photo, the flash momentarily illuminating the alley and revealing her face in stark, horrifying detail. The charred skin, the glowing eyes, the tears that left wet streaks down her blackened cheeks. The image burned itself into his mind, and he felt a wave of nausea and fear so intense he thought he might pass out. The group ran, scattering in different directions, their earlier confidence shattered by the reality of what they had seen. Takeshi made it back to his apartment and locked the door, his heart pounding, his hands still shaking from the adrenaline. He developed the photo the next day, hoping it would provide some kind of proof, some validation that what they had seen was real. But when the image appeared in the developing tray, his blood ran cold. The woman was there, standing exactly where she had been in the alley, but her face was turned toward the camera now, staring directly into the lens. Her eyes seemed to glow even in the photograph, and her mouth was open as if she were screaming, though Takeshi didn't remember hearing any sound. Worse still, in the lower corner of the photo, barely visible, was a hand, reaching toward the camera as if trying to pull herself through the image. Takeshi destroyed the photo immediately, tearing it into pieces and burning the fragments in his sink, but the damage was done. That night, he woke to the smell of smoke and found burn marks on his neck, 5 distinct fingerprints seared into his skin. He left Osaka the following week and never returned, and when the other students tried to contact him years later, they found that he had moved several times, never staying in one place for long, as if he were trying to outrun something that refused to let him go. The cinder-faced woman is still seen today, though sightings have become less frequent over the years. Those who study urban legends suggest that her appearances might be tied to the anniversary of the fire, or to certain atmospheric conditions that trigger collective memory and fear. But the locals who live in Nishinari know better. They know that some things cannot be explained away by science or psychology, that some tragedies leave scars so deep they bleed into the present, refusing to be forgotten. They avoid the alleys near the old tenement site, especially after dark, and they teach their children to do the same. And if they ever catch the smell of burning flesh on the wind, or hear the sound of sizzling footsteps in the night, they walk the other way without looking back, because they know that some encounters leave marks that never fully heal, burns that go deeper than skin, straight into the soul where fear lives and waits. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. And while these stories already seem unbelievable, what comes next takes horror to a darker and more mysterious level. Because in the following tales, the things that begin as coincidences twist into something far more terrifying, where the line between the living and the dead becomes so thin it might as well not exist at all. In the next part, we'll explore encounters that don't just haunt their victims for a night, but follow them for years, leaving trails of dread that stretch across cities and generations, proving that some ghosts refuse to stay in the past where they belong. There are streets in Phnom Penh where even the most seasoned tuk-tuk drivers refuse to pick up passengers after midnight, routes that cut through older neighborhoods where the buildings lean close together and the streetlights flicker with a rhythm that feels almost intentional. These drivers have learned to trust their instincts, to recognize the subtle signs that something is wrong. The unnatural stillness of a street that should have at least some signs of life, the way shadows seem to gather in certain corners, as if drawn there by something unseen. But sometimes, even the most cautious among them make mistakes. And when they do, they encounter a child who should not be there. A little girl standing alone in the middle of an empty street, her small hands clutched tightly around her own throat. She never speaks, never calls out for help, but her presence is impossible to ignore, and those who stop to check on her quickly realize that something is deeply, terribly wrong. Because when she lowers her hands, there is no scream, no cry for help, just a gaping opening where her voice should be, a wound that looks fresh and bloodless, as if it were created just moments ago, and refuses to heal. The neighborhood of Tuol Kork has a complicated history, one that stretches back through decades of turmoil and violence, periods when entire families disappeared overnight, and questions were better left unasked. By the early 2000s, it had transformed into a relatively quiet residential area, filled with middle-class families, small shops, and narrow streets that wound through clusters of aging apartment buildings. But the past never fully lets go in places like this, and the older residents still remembered the stories, the whispered accounts of children who had vanished during the darker years, taken from their homes in the night and never seen again. One name that came up more often than others was Shrammau, a 7-year-old girl who had lived with her grandmother in a small house near the old market. According to the few who still talked about her, she had been a bright, talkative child, the kind who asked endless questions and sang to herself while helping her grandmother with chores. In 1979, during one of the most chaotic periods in the city's history, she disappeared. The official story was that she had wandered off and gotten lost, but her grandmother insisted until her dying day that Shrammau had been taken, silenced because she had seen something she wasn't supposed to see, witnessed something that powerful people wanted buried. The grandmother claimed that on the night Shrammau vanished, she heard the girl scream once, a high, piercing sound that was cut off abruptly, as if someone had clamped a hand over her mouth or worse. When the grandmother ran outside, the street was empty. No sign of Shrammau, no sign of anyone. Just silence, thick and oppressive, as if the night itself had swallowed the sound of her granddaughter's voice. The first modern sighting of the child occurred in late 2003, when a tuk-tuk driver named Sareth was making his way home after a long shift. It was nearly 1 a.m, and the streets were deserted, the usual hum of traffic and voices replaced by an eerie quiet that made him uneasy. He turned onto a narrow side street that served as a shortcut to his neighborhood, and that's when he saw her. A small figure standing in the middle of the road, motionless, her back to him. Sareth slowed down, assuming it was a lost child, and called out to her, asking if she needed help. The girl didn't respond, didn't turn around, just stood there with her hands pressed tightly against her throat. Sareth felt a prickle of unease, but forced himself to stop and get out of the tuk-tuk. He approached slowly, his footsteps echoing off the buildings on either side, and as he got closer, he noticed details that made his stomach tighten. The girl was wearing an old-fashioned dress, the kind children might have worn decades ago, and her hair hung loose and tangled around her shoulders. Her bare feet were caked with dirt, and she stood perfectly still, not swaying or shifting her weight the way a living child would. Sareth reached out to touch her shoulder, to turn her around, and the moment his fingers made contact, she spun to face him with a speed that was unnatural, inhuman. Her eyes were wide and glassy, filled with a terror so profound it seemed to radiate outward, and her hands remained locked around her throat. Sareth opened his mouth to speak, to ask what was wrong, and that's when she lowered her hands. What he saw made him stagger backward, his breath catching in his throat. Where the girl's neck should have been smooth and intact, there was instead a gaping wound, a horizontal opening that went from one side to the other, deep enough that he could see the dark hollow beyond. There was no blood, no torn flesh, just the wound itself, clean and impossible, as if someone had removed her voice box entirely. The girl's mouth moved, forming words that produced no sound, and Sareth realized with horror that she was trying to speak, trying to scream, but nothing came out except a faint, wet clicking sound, like air moving through a blocked passage. He stumbled back to his tuk-tuk, his legs barely supporting him, and drove away without looking back, his hands shaking so badly he nearly crashed twice before making it home. When he told his wife what he had seen, she made him promise never to drive that route again, and Sareth, who had never been a superstitious man, agreed without hesitation. The image of the girl stayed with him, appearing in his dreams night after night, her silent mouth forming words he couldn't hear, her hands reaching toward him, as if begging for help he didn't know how to give. Within a month, other drivers began reporting similar encounters. Always late at night, always on empty streets, always the same small figure with her hands clutched around her throat. Some described hearing a faint choking sound just before they saw her, a wet gurgling that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, and a few claimed that the sound followed them home, appearing in their bedrooms while they slept, a soft, persistent noise near their ears that woke them in a cold sweat. The sightings escalated through 2004 and into 2005, and a pattern began to emerge. Those who encountered the girl and stopped to help her, those who made eye contact or tried to speak to her, reported experiencing the same disturbing phenomenon. They would wake in the middle of the night to the sound of choking, a desperate, gasping noise that seemed to be right beside their heads, and when they opened their eyes, they would see her standing at the foot of their bed. She never moved, never approached, just stood there with her hands around her throat, her eyes locked on theirs, and the wound in her neck visible even in the darkness. The encounters lasted anywhere from a few seconds to several minutes, and when the figure finally disappeared, it did so abruptly, fading into nothing as if she had never been there. But the psychological impact was severe. People became afraid to sleep alone, afraid to turn off the lights, afraid to drive through certain parts of the city after dark. Some moved away entirely, unwilling to risk another encounter, while others sought help from monks and spiritual healers, desperate for protection or explanation. A local journalist named Sophia became interested in the story and began interviewing witnesses, collecting their accounts, and trying to piece together a coherent narrative. What she found was both fascinating and deeply disturbing. Nearly all of the witnesses described the girl in identical terms: the old-fashioned dress, the tangled hair, the gaping wound in her throat, and several of them independently mentioned a detail that Sophia found particularly chilling. They said that when the girl's mouth moved, when she tried to speak but produced no sound, they could somehow understand what she was trying to say. The words formed in their minds as if transmitted directly, bypassing the need for actual speech, and the message was always the same: "Help me find my voice." Sophia tracked down Shrammau's grandmother, now in her 80s and living in a nursing home on the outskirts of the city. The old woman was frail but sharp, her memories of the night her granddaughter disappeared still vivid and painful. She told Sophia the full story, or at least as much of it as she knew. Shrammau had been playing outside that evening when she saw something she shouldn't have: a group of men dragging another man into an alley, beating him while he screamed for help. The little girl had run home and told her grandmother what she had seen, describing the men in detail, and the grandmother, terrified, had told her to stay inside and never speak of it again. But it was too late. Later that night, someone came to their door. The grandmother heard voices, low and threatening, and then Shrammau's scream, that single piercing cry that was cut off so abruptly, it left a ringing silence in its wake. By the time the grandmother made it outside, the street was empty. Shrammau was gone, and no amount of searching or pleading with authorities ever brought her back. The grandmother believed, and had always believed, that the men had silenced her granddaughter permanently, ensuring she could never identify them or testify to what she had seen. And now, decades later, it seemed that Shrammau was still trying to speak, still trying to tell her story, her voice stolen but her presence refusing to be erased. Sophia published an article about the sightings and the possible connection to Shrammau, and the response was immediate. Dozens of people came forward with their own stories, some claiming to have seen the child, others reporting strange occurrences in their homes: the sound of choking, the feeling of being watched, the sensation of small, cold hands touching their throats while they slept. The encounters reached a peak in the summer of 2006, when a young mother named Chenda woke one night to find the girl standing beside her bed, so close that Chenda could have reached out and touched her. The child's hands were around her throat, as always, and her eyes were fixed on Chenda's face with an intensity that felt almost pleading. Chenda, paralyzed with fear, couldn't move, couldn't scream, could only stare back as the girl's mouth began to move. The words formed in Chenda's mind, clear and desperate. "They took my voice so I couldn't tell." The girl lowered her hands, revealing the wound, and Chenda saw something she hadn't expected. Inside the opening, where there should have been only darkness, there was a faint glow, a soft pulsing light that seemed to beat in time with a heart that should no longer exist. The girl reached toward Chenda, her small fingers brushing against Chenda's throat, and the touch was ice cold, so cold it burned. Then the figure disappeared, leaving Chenda gasping and shaking, her hand flying to her own throat to check for injury. There was none, no mark, no wound, but the sensation of that touch lingered for days, a phantom cold that wouldn't fade no matter how many hot showers she took or layers of clothing she wore. Chenda went to a monk the next morning, explaining what had happened and begging for help. The monk listened carefully, his expression grave, and then told her something that made her blood run cold. He said that the child was not seeking revenge, not trying to harm anyone, but was instead searching for someone who could give her back what was taken, someone who could speak the truth she had been silenced for trying to tell. Until that happened, she would continue to appear, continue to mark those who encountered her, leaving them with a burden they didn't fully understand. The sightings have continued sporadically over the years, though they seem to cluster around certain times and places. The neighborhood where Shrammau once lived remains a hot spot, and tuk-tuk drivers have learned to avoid it after midnight, taking longer routes rather than risk an encounter. Those who have seen the child and survived the experience report lasting effects, a heightened sensitivity to certain sounds, especially choking or gasping noises, and vivid nightmares in which they relive the encounter over and over. Some claim to feel a presence watching them, particularly when they're alone, and a few have reported seeing the girl's reflection in mirrors or windows, always standing just behind them, her hands around her throat, her mouth moving soundlessly. The most disturbing detail, however, comes from those who have been marked multiple times, who have seen the child more than once and lived to tell about it. They say that with each encounter, the wound in her throat seems deeper, more pronounced, as if it's growing or expanding, consuming more of her with each passing year. And they say that the glow inside the wound, that faint, pulsing light, is growing brighter, stronger, as if whatever was taken from her is slowly being rebuilt through the fear and acknowledgement of those who witness her presence. The local authorities dismiss the sightings as urban legend, a shared delusion fueled by old stories and collective anxiety. But the people who live in Tuol Cork know better. They teach their children not to walk alone at night, not to stop if they see a small figure standing in the middle of the street, and above all, never to make eye contact with a child whose hands are clutched around her own throat, because some silences are louder than screams, and some voices refuse to stay buried, no matter how deeply they were forced down. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow, we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. The horror of a silenced child is one thing, but there are other tragedies that haunt the living. Stories where joy and celebration are twisted into something dark and final. Weddings are supposed to be moments of pure happiness, beginnings rather than endings. But in certain places, the boundary between life and death becomes dangerously thin when vows are about to be spoken. In the heart of Lahore, there stands a hall where brides have learned to keep their eyes averted from the upper balconies, where photographers check their equipment twice before shooting, and where the shadow of a woman in white has turned what should be the happiest day into something far more sinister. The Regal Palace Wedding Hall in Lahore's Old City has been hosting marriages for nearly 50 years. A grand structure built in the late 1960s with high ceilings, ornate balconies, and chandeliers that cast warm golden light across marble floors. It was designed to be elegant and timeless, a place where families could celebrate their most important occasions in style, and for many years, it fulfilled that promise without incident. The hall became known for its beauty and its impeccable service, and booking it months in advance became a point of pride for families who wanted their daughters' weddings to be memorable. But in the autumn of 1983, something happened that would forever alter the hall's reputation, an event so disturbing that it was hushed up immediately, buried under layers of official silence and family shame. A young bride named Amina was preparing for her wedding ceremony, scheduled to begin at 7 in the evening, when she vanished. She had been in the bridal preparation room with her sisters and cousins just minutes before, adjusting her heavy red and gold lehenga and checking her makeup in the mirror. Someone had stepped out to fetch more hairpins, and when they returned, Amina was gone. The room was empty, her jewelry laid out on the table, her shoes still sitting by the door. A frantic search began immediately, family members and staff combing through every room in the hall, calling her name, checking bathrooms and storage closets, but there was no sign of her. It was nearly an hour later when one of the younger cousins, a girl named Sana, looked up at the second-floor balcony that overlooked the main hall and saw something that made her scream. Hanging from the ornate wooden railing, swaying gently despite the complete absence of any breeze, was Amina. She was still wearing her bridal dress, the heavy fabric draped around her like a shroud, and her head was tilted at an angle that left no doubt she was dead. The dupatta that had been carefully arranged over her hair was now wrapped tightly around her neck. The delicate fabric pulled so taut it had left deep grooves in her skin. The family's screams brought everyone running, and within minutes, the hall was in chaos. The police were called, the wedding guests sent home, and Amina's body was carefully cut down and examined. The official ruling was suicide, a conclusion that devastated her family and left more questions than answers. Amina had shown no signs of depression or distress, no indication that she might take her own life, and those who knew her insisted that she had been excited about the wedding, genuinely happy to be marrying her fiancé. But the authorities were firm in their assessment, and the case was closed within days. Amina was buried quietly, her death attributed to last-minute panic or cold feet, and the Regal Palace Wedding Hall resumed operations after a respectful interval, the owners hoping that time would allow people to forget what had happened. But the building itself seemed unwilling to let the memory fade. Within a year of Amina's death, other brides began reporting strange experiences during their own wedding preparations. Several claimed to have seen a figure on the upper balcony, a woman in a bridal dress standing near the railing, visible only for a moment before disappearing. The figure was always pale, almost luminescent in the dim light, and her dress appeared to sway and move, even though she stood perfectly still. Photographers working weddings at the hall started noticing anomalies in their images, strange distortions and corrupted files that only seemed to occur when they were shooting in the main hall. One photographer, a man named Farhan, who had worked hundreds of weddings without incident, reviewed his photos from a ceremony at the Regal Palace and found something that made him question his own sanity. In several shots of the bride and groom posing together, there was a third figure visible in the background, partially transparent but unmistakable. It was a woman in a white bridal dress, standing on the balcony above them, her face obscured by shadow, but her posture suggesting she was leaning forward, watching them intently. Farhan had been present during the entire shoot and was certain no one had been on that balcony. He showed the images to the bride's family, who insisted he delete them immediately and never speak of what he had seen. Farhan complied, but the experience left him deeply shaken, and he refused to work at the Regal Palace again. The sightings became more frequent through the 1990s and into the 2000s, and a pattern emerged that made the incidents even more disturbing. The figure seemed to appear most often during weddings where the bride herself was uncertain or fearful, marriages arranged by families where the bride had expressed doubts about her future husband or the match itself. Several brides reported seeing the woman on the balcony and feeling an immediate, overwhelming urge to approach her, to climb the stairs and stand beside her, as if drawn by some invisible force. Most resisted, shaking off the feeling and attributing it to pre-wedding nerves, but a few didn't. In 1997, a bride named Noor excused herself during her own Mendi ceremony, telling her sisters she needed fresh air. She walked up the stairs to the second floor, moving as if in a trance, and was found 20 minutes later standing at the balcony railing, her hands gripping the wood so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Her eyes were unfocused, staring at something no one else could see, and when her sisters pulled her away, she collapsed, sobbing uncontrollably. She refused to continue with the wedding, breaking off the engagement despite her family's protests, and later confided to a close friend that she had seen Amina on the balcony, standing exactly where she had died, and that Amina had whispered something to her, a warning that if Noor went through with the marriage, she would end up in the same place, hanging from the same railing, her life cut short by a man who didn't truly love her. The legend of the swaying corpse bride spread through Lahore's wedding circuit, whispered among brides and their families, and while some dismissed it as superstition, others took it seriously enough to avoid the regal palace entirely. The hall's owners, desperate to maintain their business, hired religious scholars to perform cleansing rituals, brought in purs to bless the space and ward off evil, but nothing seemed to help. The sightings continued, and worse, some brides who saw the figure and ignored the warning disappeared before their wedding days arrived. In 2004, a young woman named Hira saw the pale bride on the balcony during her engagement party at the hall. She told her mother what she had seen, but her mother dismissed it as nervousness and insisted the wedding proceed as planned. 3 days before the ceremony, Hira vanished from her home. Her family launched a massive search involving police and private investigators, but no trace of her was ever found. Her belongings were still in her room, her phone and identification left behind, as if she had simply walked out the door and ceased to exist. The only clue was a note found tucked into her wedding lehenga, written in Hira's handwriting, but in words that didn't sound like her. It said only, "She showed me what would happen, and I chose a different ending." The family was devastated, the wedding canceled, and Hira's fiancé, when questioned by investigators, admitted under pressure that he had been involved with another woman and had planned to continue the affair after the marriage. The revelation confirmed what many had begun to suspect, that the figure on the balcony wasn't simply haunting the hall, but was actively intervening, protecting brides from futures that would destroy them. By 2010, the regal palace had become infamous, its once sterling reputation tarnished by years of disturbing incidents and whispered warnings. Bookings dropped dramatically, and several competing halls opened nearby, offering similar amenities without the dark history. But the hall remained open, primarily serving families who either didn't believe the stories or were too committed to tradition to care. Those who did book weddings there often hired extra security, stationed guards on the second floor to prevent anyone from going near the balcony, and instructed photographers to avoid shooting in certain areas. But the figure couldn't be controlled or contained. She appeared when she wanted, visible to some and invisible to others, and her presence was always accompanied by the same unsettling phenomena. The temperature in the hall would drop suddenly, breath misting in the air despite functioning heaters, and guests would report feeling watched, followed by unseen eyes that seemed to track their every movement. Some heard whispers, soft feminine voices speaking in Urdu, too low to make out individual words but clear enough to convey a sense of warning or grief. And always, in the photographs taken that night, there would be anomalies, corrupted images, blurred faces, or the faint outline of a woman in white, standing somewhere she shouldn't be. The most detailed account of an encounter with the swaying corpse bride came from a wedding planner named Ayesha, who worked at the hall for nearly a decade despite the rumors. She had seen strange things over the years, odd shadows and unexplained cold spots, but had always managed to rationalize them away. In the spring of 2015, she was coordinating a wedding for a bride named Zara, a quiet young woman who seemed withdrawn and unhappy despite the celebration happening around her. Asha noticed that Zara kept glancing up at the second-floor balcony, her expression troubled, and when Asha asked if something was wrong, Zara simply said that she felt like someone was watching her, someone who wanted to tell her something important. Aisha tried to reassure her, but as the evening progressed, she began to feel uneasy as well. The air in the hall felt heavy, oppressive, and the lights flickered intermittently, despite having been checked that morning. Then, during the formal photography session, Asha looked up at the balcony and saw her, Amina, or the thing that had once been Amina, standing at the railing in her tattered bridal dress, her face pale and expressionless, her eyes fixed on Zara with an intensity that was almost physical. Asha felt her breath catch, felt a wave of cold wash over her, and in that moment she understood. The figure wasn't there to frighten or harm, but to warn, to offer a choice that Amina herself had never been given. Aisha grabbed Zara's arm and pulled her aside, speaking quickly and urgently, telling her that if she had any doubts, any fears about the marriage, now was the time to voice them, to walk away if necessary, because some mistakes couldn't be undone. Zara broke down, admitting through tears that her fiancé had been controlling and possessive, that she was terrified of what her life would become after the wedding, but felt trapped by family expectations and social pressure. Asha helped her leave the hall that night, escorted her to a safe place where she could think clearly, and within days, Zara had called off the wedding, facing her family's anger, but choosing her own safety and future over tradition. Asha never saw the figure on the balcony again after that night, as if Amina's spirit had accomplished what it set out to do, at least for one bride. But the sightings at the regal palace continue, though they have become less frequent in recent years. The hall still operates, though at a fraction of its former capacity, and those who work there have learned to recognize the signs, the sudden cold, the flickering lights, the pale figure swaying gently on the upper balcony. They warn brides to trust their instincts, to listen if they feel something pulling at them, because in that hall, the dead have found a way to speak, and their message is always the same. Some commitments are worse than death, and some endings are kinder than the futures they prevent. The swaying corpse bride remains, a guardian of sorts, tragic and terrible. Her presence, a reminder that even in death, some souls refuse to let others suffer the way they did, and that the line between protection and haunting is often impossible to distinguish. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. The last two stories are different. They're quieter, but far more disturbing, the kind that stay with you long after the telling ends. Because sometimes the most terrifying hauntings aren't the ones that scream and attack, but the ones that whisper and wait, the ones that unfold slowly over months or years, weaving themselves so deeply into people's lives that by the time they realize what's happening, it's far too late to escape. In the final part of this collection, we'll explore encounters that don't just frighten but transform, leaving their victims changed in ways they can never fully explain, marked by experiences that blur the line between the supernatural and the deeply, disturbingly human. There are rivers in India that carry more than water, currents that seem to pull at something deeper than the physical body, tugging at memories and grief that refuse to stay submerged. The Adyar River in Chennai has always been a place of contradictions, its waters sustaining life during the monsoon season, while claiming lives during floods, its banks hosting both celebrations and mourning rituals, its reputation shifting between sacred and cursed depending on who you ask. But there is one stretch of the river, a bend where the water runs deep and slow near the old fishing village of Koturparam, where even the most experienced fishermen refuse to cast their nets after sunset. They say that when the moon is high and the water reflects its light like scattered silver, a woman appears, standing waist-deep in the current with her back to the shore, her arms cradling something that isn't there. She rocks gently, her movements rhythmic and tender, and if you listen carefully, you can hear her singing, a lullaby that sounds wrong somehow, the melody distorted, as if multiple voices are singing at once, overlapping and out of sync. Those who have seen her describe a feeling of profound sorrow that emanates from her figure, a grief so heavy it seems to weigh down the very air, making it hard to breathe, hard to think about anything except loss and the unbearable weight of absence. The village of Kotorpuram has existed on the banks of the Adyar River for centuries, its residents primarily fishermen and their families who have learned to read the river's moods, to know when it's safe to venture out and when it's better to stay ashore. The river provides their livelihood but demands respect, and over the generations, certain rules have been passed down, unwritten laws that everyone follows without question. Don't fish alone after dark. Don't ignore the warning signs when the water suddenly goes still. And above all, never approach a woman standing in the river at night, no matter how much she might appear to need help. The origin of this last rule goes back to 1989, when a young mother named Lakshmi drowned in the river along with her infant son. The details of what happened that night are still disputed, with some claiming it was an accident, and others insisting it was something far more deliberate and tragic. What is known for certain is that Lakshmi had been struggling. Her husband had left her months earlier, abandoning her and the child without warning or support, and she had been living with her parents, trying to make ends meet while caring for a baby who cried constantly and slept little. On a humid July evening, she was last seen walking toward the river with her son wrapped in a cloth bundle against her chest. Neighbors assumed she was going to wash clothes or fetch water, routine tasks that women performed every day. But when she didn't return by nightfall, her father went looking for her and found her sandals on the riverbank, placed neatly side by side, and nothing else. The search began immediately, villagers spreading out along both banks, calling her name, checking the places where the current might have carried her if she had fallen in. It took 3 days before they found the bodies, Lakshmi and her son tangled together in the roots of a submerged tree nearly a kilometer downstream. The sight of them was something the recovery team never forgot, the way Lakshmi's arms were still wrapped around the child, her grip so tight they had to pry her fingers loose to separate them. Her face, preserved by the cool water, wore an expression that was difficult to interpret, something between anguish and peace, as if in her final moments she had been both terrified and relieved. The village mourned, performed the proper rituals, and tried to move on. But within weeks, the sightings began. Fishermen, working late, reported seeing a figure in the water, a woman who appeared suddenly in places where the river was too deep for anyone to stand comfortably. She would be there for a moment, rocking back and forth, and then she would vanish, leaving only ripples that spread outward in perfect circles. At first, people dismissed it as grief playing tricks on the mind, shared guilt manifesting as collective hallucination. But the encounters became too frequent and too consistent to ignore. Multiple witnesses, people who hadn't known each other and hadn't discussed what they had seen, described identical details. The woman's wet hair hanging loose down her back, the way her sari clung to her body, the bundle in her arms that she cradled with such tenderness it was heartbreaking to watch. The first person to approach her was a fisherman named Ravi, a kind-hearted man in his 50s who had known Lakshmi and felt responsible for not noticing how much she had been struggling before her death. He saw the figure one night in late August, standing in the shallows where the riverbed slopes gently, before dropping off into deeper water. She had her back to him, swaying slightly, and he could hear her singing, that strange overlapping lullaby that made his skin prickle with unease. Ravi called out to her, his voice gentle, asking if she needed help, and the figure stopped moving. The silence that followed was absolute, as if every sound in the world had been suddenly muted, and then she turned. Ravi saw her face clearly in the moonlight, saw that it was indeed Lakshmi, her features recognizable but changed somehow, her eyes too dark, her skin too pale, her expression fixed in a smile that didn't reach those empty eyes. She lifted the bundle in her arms, holding it out toward him as if offering him a gift, and Ravi, acting on instinct and compassion, waded into the water toward her. He reached out to take the bundle, to see what she was holding, and that's when she unwrapped it. The cloth fell away to reveal nothing, just wet fabric and empty space, and Ravi stumbled backward, his heart hammering in his chest. Lakshmi's smile widened, her mouth opening impossibly far, and she screamed. The sound was unlike anything Ravi had ever heard, multiple voices layered over each other, some high and childlike, others deep and guttural, all of them expressing a rage and grief so profound it felt like it might tear the world apart. Ravi ran, crashing through the water and hauling himself onto the bank, not stopping until he reached his home where he collapsed, gasping and trembling. He tried to explain to his wife what had happened, but the words came out jumbled and incoherent, and she called for the village elder, an old man named Krishnan, who had lived through enough strangeness to take such claims seriously. Krishnan listened to Ravi's account, his expression growing darker with each detail, and when Ravi finished, the old man sighed heavily and said something that made everyone in the room go quiet. He said that Lakshmi had not drowned by accident, that she had walked into the river deliberately, choosing death for herself and her child because she saw no other way out of her despair. And now she was trapped, her spirit, bound to the place where she had made that terrible choice, reliving it over and over, searching for the child she had taken with her, unable to understand that he was already gone. Krishnan warned that anyone who approached her, anyone who tried to help or interfere, would be seen as a threat or a replacement, and she would lash out with all the fury of a mother who believes her baby is being taken from her. From that night on, Ravi refused to fish in that section of the river, and he warned everyone he knew to stay away, but not everyone listened. Over the following months, other fishermen reported encounters, each one more disturbing than the last. Some claimed their boats capsized in calm water for no apparent reason, the vessels flipping as if pulled from below. Survivors described feeling hands on their legs, thin fingers wrapping around their ankles and dragging them down into the dark current, and they swore the hands were cold and impossibly strong. In 1992, a teenager named Arun nearly drowned when he went swimming in the river against his parents' wishes. He surfaced choking and screaming, claiming that something had grabbed him from below, pulling him deeper and deeper until his lungs burned, and his vision started to fade. He fought free at the last moment, kicking hard and breaking the surface, and when he looked back, he saw a woman's face just beneath the water, staring up at him with those dark, empty eyes. Arun never went near the river again, and the incident reinforced the warnings that parents gave their children. Stay away from the river at night. Don't swim alone. And if you hear singing, a lullaby that sounds like many voices at once, run immediately without looking back. The warnings were heeded by most, but every few years, someone new would ignore them, either out of skepticism or bravado, and the encounters would continue. Boat engines would die suddenly, stranding fishermen in the dark, while that eerie lullaby drifted across the water. People walking along the riverbank would hear splashing behind them, turn to see ripples spreading from a spot where no one should be, and feel the overwhelming urge to flee. And always, in the stories that made their way back to the village, there was the image of Lakshmi standing in the water, rocking her empty arms, her face frozen in that terrible smile that spoke of madness and unbearable loss. By the early 2000s, the legend had spread beyond Kotorpuram, becoming part of Chennai's broader folklore. But for those who lived near the river, it was no legend. It was a fact of life, something they navigated around the way you would navigate around a dangerous animal or a crumbling building. In 2007, a documentary filmmaker from Mumbai came to the village, wanting to interview people about the riverbound mother, as she had come to be called in the local newspapers. The villagers were reluctant to speak on camera, but the filmmaker was persistent, and eventually, an old woman named Savitri agreed to tell her story. Savitri had been Lakshmi's neighbor, had known her well, and she spoke with a sadness that felt tangible, describing a young woman who had been kind and hopeful before circumstances crushed her spirit. Savitri blamed herself for not doing more, for not reaching out, when it became clear that Lakshmi was struggling, and she said that the haunting, if that's what it was, felt less like revenge and more like a plea, a desperate mother still searching for the child she had taken into the water, unable to accept that he was gone. The filmmaker asked if Savitri had ever seen the figure herself, and the old woman nodded slowly. She said that one night, unable to sleep, she had gone to the river to sit and think, and she had seen Lakshmi standing in the shallows. Savitri hadn't approached, hadn't called out, had simply sat and watched as the figure rocked back and forth, singing that awful lullaby. And in that moment, Savitri said, she understood. The haunting wasn't about scaring people away or claiming victims. It was about grief that had nowhere to go, sorrow so deep it had carved a permanent mark on the world, creating a loop that replayed endlessly because the spirit trapped within it couldn't move forward. I couldn't let go. The sightings continue to this day, though they have become less frequent as development has pushed the fishing village farther from the riverbank, and modern apartments have risen where simple houses once stood. But the river itself hasn't changed, and neither has the figure that appears in its waters when conditions are right. Fishermen who still work that stretch of the Adyar know to be careful, to watch for the signs, and leave immediately if they see a woman standing where no one should be able to stand. There have been no drownings attributed directly to the riverbound mother in recent years, though several close calls have been reported, incidents where people felt themselves being pulled under and only barely escaped. The most disturbing accounts come from those who claim to have heard her lullaby up close, the overlapping voices creating a harmony that is both beautiful and deeply wrong, as if the song itself is fractured, broken into pieces that don't quite fit together anymore. Those who hear it say they feel an overwhelming sadness afterward, a grief that isn't their own but settles into them like a weight, leaving them listless and melancholy for days or even weeks. Some have sought help from priests and therapists, trying to shake the feeling, while others simply wait for it to fade on its own, knowing that some encounters leave marks that time alone can heal. The river flows on, carrying its secrets and its sorrows, and somewhere in its depths, a mother continues her eternal vigil, searching for a child she will never find, her arms forever empty, her song forever echoing across the water, like a wound that refuses to close. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. From the sorrow of a mother's endless search, we turn now to something altogether different. A horror that isn't rooted in grief, but in the twisted mechanics of death itself, in the way a body can be broken and yet refuse to stop moving. In the crowded back alleys of Hong Kong, where surveillance cameras capture every corner and nothing should be able to hide, there walks a figure that defies explanation. A man whose very movement violates the natural order, whose presence has been documented on film yet remains impossible to understand. Those who see him never forget the sound his joints make, the wet cracking that accompanies each deliberate step, or the way his head sits wrong on his shoulders, twisted completely around, so that while his body walks backward, his face stares forward, watching, always watching. The Kowloon district has always been a maze, a dense urban sprawl where narrow alleys twist between buildings stacked so close together that sunlight barely reaches the ground. It's a place where old Hong Kong still exists beneath layers of modernity, where street markets operate beside high-end boutiques and fortune-tellers set up shop next to convenience stores. The alleys are watched by countless security cameras, installed by businesses and residents hoping to deter crime. But in the past decade, these cameras have captured something that no one anticipated, something that has turned Kowloon's back streets into a subject of fascination and dread. The first footage appeared online in 2011, uploaded by a convenience store owner who had been reviewing his security recordings after noticing that several customers had complained about feeling watched while walking past his shop late at night. The video showed a typical evening scene, the alley empty except for the occasional pedestrian or stray cat, and then at exactly 2:43 in the morning, a figure entered the frame. At first glance, it appeared to be a man, tall and thin, dressed in dark clothing that might have been a suit or work uniform. But something about the way he moved was immediately wrong. He was walking backward, his steps smooth and deliberate, covering ground with a speed that seemed impossible for someone moving in reverse. And his head, clearly visible in the grainy footage, was turned completely around, facing forward while his body moved away, his eyes fixed on something beyond the camera's view. The store owner watched the footage multiple times, trying to convince himself it was a technical glitch or a person playing an elaborate prank. But the more he studied it, the more certain he became that what he was seeing was real. The figure's movements were too fluid, too precise, to be someone awkwardly shuffling backward, and the angle of his head suggested that his neck was rotated far beyond what human anatomy would allow. The store owner posted the video to a local forum, asking if anyone else had seen something similar, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. Within days, dozens of people came forward with their own accounts. Taxi drivers reported picking up fares who mentioned seeing a man walking backward through the alleys, his head twisted around in an unnatural position. Security guards working night shifts in nearby buildings confirmed they had seen the figure on their monitors, always between 2 and 4 in the morning, always moving with that same eerie backward gait. And several pedestrians described encountering him in person, the moment of shock when they realized what they were seeing, the way his joints seemed to crack and pop with each step, a sound like breaking bones that echoed off the narrow walls. One woman, a nurse named May, who worked late shifts at a nearby hospital, described walking home through an alley and hearing footsteps behind her. She turned, expecting to see another pedestrian, and instead found herself face to face with the backward-walking man. He was less than 2 meters away, close enough that she could see his features clearly, and what she saw made her blood run cold. His face was gaunt and colorless, the skin stretched tight over prominent cheekbones, and his eyes were wide and unblinking, reflecting the dim alley light like polished glass. But it was the angle of his head that horrified her most, twisted so far around that she could see the strain in his neck, the unnatural bulge where vertebrae pressed against skin. He didn't acknowledge her, didn't change his expression or alter his pace, just continued walking backward past her, his body moving with mechanical precision while his head remained fixed forward, staring at something only he could see. May heard his joints crack with each step, a series of sharp pops that made her stomach turn, and she stood frozen until he disappeared around a corner, the sound of his footsteps fading into the distance. She went to the police the next morning, filing a report that was taken seriously only because she wasn't the first person to come forward with such a story. The police reviewed security footage from cameras in the area and found multiple instances of the figure appearing, always in the early morning hours, always moving backward, always alone. They launched an investigation, checking missing persons reports and trying to identify the man, but every lead went nowhere. The clothing he wore was too generic to trace, his features too indistinct in the footage to match with any database, and witnesses who had seen him up close provided descriptions that varied enough to make identification impossible. The legend that grew up around the backward walking man suggested a possible explanation, though whether it was true or simply a story people told to make sense of something incomprehensible remained unclear. According to those who claimed to know the history, the figure was the ghost of a man named Chung, who had died in the late 1990s while trying to escape members of a triad gang. Chung had allegedly stolen money from the gang, a sum large enough to warrant severe punishment, and when they came for him, he ran. The chase took him through the narrow alleys of Kowloon, a labyrinth he knew well, but his pursuers knew it better. They cornered him in a dead end, where his only escape route was a drainage tunnel, a narrow pipe barely wide enough for a person to crawl through. Chung entered the tunnel head first, but quickly realized he couldn't turn around, and in his panic, he tried to crawl backward, dragging himself through the filthy water while his attackers waited at the entrance, taunting him. The tunnel collapsed partway through, old concrete giving way under pressure, and Chung was trapped, his body wedged in the narrow space, his neck twisted at an agonizing angle as he struggled to free himself. He died there, alone in the dark, his last moments spent trying to move backward through a space that offered no escape, his neck breaking as he thrashed against the weight of debris. Whether this story was true or fabricated didn't matter to those who encountered the backward walking man, because the figure's behavior seemed to support it. He moved as if still trying to escape, still crawling backward through that tunnel, his twisted neck a permanent reminder of how he had died. And there was another detail that multiple witnesses reported, something that made the encounters even more disturbing. The figure seemed to be searching for something or someone, his eyes scanning the alley as he moved, and if a person looked away too quickly, if they turned their back or tried to flee, he would change direction, following them with that same backward gait, the sound of cracking joints growing louder as he closed the distance. Several taxi drivers reported this phenomenon, describing how they had seen the figure in their rearview mirrors, walking backward down the street behind their cabs. When they accelerated to get away, the figure would move faster, keeping pace impossible though it was, until they turned onto a main road with brighter lights and heavier traffic. At that point, the figure would simply vanish, disappearing as if he had never been there, leaving the drivers shaken and questioning their own sanity. In 2014, a group of urban explorers decided to investigate the legend, armed with cameras and recording equipment, determined to capture definitive proof of the backward walking man's existence. They spent several nights patrolling the alleys where sightings had been most frequent, documenting their search and uploading videos to a popular streaming platform. For the first 3 nights, they found nothing unusual, just empty alleys and the occasional late-night pedestrian. But on the 4th night, around 3 in the morning, their luck changed in a way they would come to regret. They were walking through a particularly narrow passage between 2 apartment buildings when they heard it, the distinctive sound of cracking joints, rhythmic and wet, echoing off the walls from somewhere ahead. The group stopped, their cameras still rolling, and watched as a figure emerged from the shadows at the far end of the alley. It was him, the backward walking man, moving toward them with that uncanny backward gait, his head twisted forward, his eyes fixed directly on them. The group's leader, a young man named Derek, called out, asking who the figure was, but there was no response. Just the relentless approach and that awful cracking sound that grew louder with each passing second. Derek raised his camera, zooming in on the figure's face, and what he captured in those few seconds before they ran would become the most viewed piece of footage associated with the legend. The figure's expression was blank, devoid of emotion or awareness, but his eyes seemed to track them, following their movements with an intensity that felt predatory. His mouth hung slightly open, revealing teeth that looked gray in the dim light, and as he got closer, the explorers could see the unnatural angle of his neck more clearly, the way the skin stretched and bulged, the way his head seemed to sit wrong on his shoulders, as if it had been forcibly turned and locked in place. Then, without warning, he stopped. The cracking sound ceased, leaving only silence, and for a moment, no one moved. Derek, emboldened by the pause, took a step forward, and the figure's head twitched, a sharp, jerking motion that made everyone watching flinch. His mouth opened wider, as if he were about to speak or scream, and Derek's nerve broke. He turned and ran, the rest of the group following close behind, their footsteps pounding against the pavement. Behind them, they could hear the cracking resume, faster now, more urgent, and when Derek risked a glance over his shoulder, he saw the figure moving after them, his backward gait impossibly swift, closing the distance despite the fact that they were running at full speed. The group burst out onto a main street, flagged down a taxi, and didn't stop shaking until they were safely back in their hotel. The footage they captured was uploaded that night and went viral within hours, analyzed frame by thousands of viewers trying to determine if it was real or an elaborate hoax. Experts weighed in, some claiming it was clever editing, others insisting that the figure's movements were too fluid, too natural to be computer-generated. The explorers themselves never returned to Kowloon, and Derek later admitted in an interview that the experience had left him with lasting psychological effects. Nightmares, where he was being chased by something that moved backward, its joints cracking with every step, its face always just out of focus, but undeniably watching him. The backward walking man continues to appear, his sightings, documented on security footage and reported by pedestrians who stumble across him in the early morning hours. The pattern remains consistent. He appears between 2 and 4 in the morning, always in narrow alleys, always moving backward with his head twisted forward. Those who encounter him and turn away too quickly report being followed, hearing the cracking of his joints growing closer, feeling a presence at their back that vanishes only when they reach a well-lit area or the safety of a building. Some have reported finding bruises on their shoulders or neck the next day, marks that suggest fingers pressed hard against skin, though they have no memory of being touched. The psychological impact of these encounters is profound, with many witnesses developing an aversion to walking alone at night, a constant need to look over their shoulder, and an inability to shake the feeling that something is following them just out of sight. The authorities have never officially acknowledged the backward walking man as anything more than an urban legend, attributing the sightings to misidentification, tricks of light, and the power of suggestion amplified by social media. But the footage exists, Dozens of videos from different cameras, different angles, all showing the same figure, the same unnatural movements, the same twisted head. And the stories persist, passed from person to person, shared in online forums and whispered in taxicabs, a modern ghost story that refuses to fade because it continues to be seen, documented, experienced. Those who study such phenomena suggest that the backward walking man represents something primal, a fear of being followed, of being pursued by something that doesn't play by the rules of the physical world, something that can move faster than you despite walking backward, something that watches you with eyes that never blink. And perhaps that's what makes him so terrifying, not just what he is, but what he represents, the idea that some deaths are so violent, so traumatic, that they leave permanent scars on reality itself, creating echoes that walk the same streets decades later, forever trapped in the moment of their ending, forever seeking something they can never find. The alleys of Kowloon remain his domain, and those who must walk them late at night do so quickly, eyes forward, refusing to look back no matter what sounds they hear behind them, because they know that some things are better left unseen, and some footsteps are better left unfollowed. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best.